Welcome, welcome. This week's lesson is about ethical relativism. I'd like to begin by reading a passage from a book by Alan Bloom called The Closing of the American Mind: How Higher Education Has Failed Democracy and Impoverished the Souls of Today's Students. Alan Bloom begins his book with the following. There's one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering the university believes, or says he believes, that truth is relative. If this belief is put to the test, one can count on the student's reaction. They will be uncomprehending. That anyone should regard the proposition as not self-evident astonishes them, as though he were calling into question 2 + 2 = 4. These are things you don't think about. The students' backgrounds are as various as America can provide. Some are religious, some atheists. Some are to the left, some to the right. Some intend to be scientists, some humanists or professionals or businessmen. Some are poor, some rich. They are unified only in their relativism and in their allegiance to equality. And the two are related in a moral intention. The relativity of truth is not a theoretical insight, but a moral postulate, the condition of a free society, or so they see it. They have all been equipped with this framework early on, and it is the modern replacement for the inalienable natural rights that used to be the traditional American grounds for a free society. That it is a moral issue for students is revealed by the character of their response when challenged, a combination of disbelief and indignation. Are you an absolutist? The only alternative they know, uttered in the same tone is, are you a monarchist? Or, do you really believe in witches? This latter leads into indignation, for someone who believes in witches might well be a witch hunter or a Salem judge. The danger they have been taught to fear from absolutism is not error, but intolerance. Relativism is necessary to openness, and this is the virtue, the only virtue, which all primary education for more than 50 years has dedicated itself to inculcating. Openness, and the relativism that makes it the only plausible stance in the face of various claims to truth and various ways of life and kinds of human beings, is the great insight of our times. The true believer is the real danger. The study of history and of cultures teaches that all the world was mad in the past. Men always thought they were right, and that led to wars, persecutions, slavery, xenophobia, racism, and chauvinism. The point is not to correct the mistakes and really be right. Rather, it is not to think you are right at all. The students, of course, cannot defend their opinion. It is something with which they have been indoctrinated. The best they can do is point out all the opinions and cultures there are and have been. What right, they ask, do I or anyone else have to say one is better than the others? If I pose the routine questions designed to confute them and make them think, such as, if you had been a British administrator in India, would you have let the natives under your governance burn the widow at the funeral of a man who had died? They either remain silent or reply that the British should never have been there in the first place. It is not that they know very much about other nations or about their own. The purpose of their education is not to make them scholars, but to provide them with a moral virtue: openness. Every educational system has a moral goal that it tries to attain and that informs its curriculum. It wants to produce a certain kind of human being. Democratic education, whether it admits it or not, wants and needs to produce men and women who have the tastes, knowledge, and character supportive of a democratic regime. Over the history of our republic, there have obviously been changes of opinion as to what kind of man is best for our regime. We began with the model of the rational and industrious man, who was honest, respected the laws, and was dedicated to the family. Above all, he was to know the rights doctrine, the Constitution, which embodied it, and American history, which presented and celebrated the founding of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. A powerful attachment to the letter and spirit of the Declaration of Independence, gently conveyed, appealed to each man's reason, was the goal of the education of democratic man. The recent education of openness has rejected all that. It pays no attention to natural rights or the historical origins of our regime, which are now thought to have been essentially flawed and regressive. It is progressive and forward-looking. It is open to all kinds of men, all kinds of lifestyles, all ideologies. There is no enemy other than the man who is not open to everything. But when there are no shared goals or vision of the public good, is the social contract any longer possible? In my experience teaching ethical relativism to students, I think Alan Bloom's commentary on this is poignant. That is, it does mirror my own experience. And I like to read that for starters to give you a sense of my perspective as a professor approaching this topic of ethical relativism. In my experience, many students in intro to ethics classes will endorse ethical relativism, and when it's put to the test will be resistant. They'll experience a kind of a cognitive dissonance. But there is a real tension between the idea that morality is relative and the idea that people have rights. And ultimately, over the course of the next couple lectures, hopefully you'll see what that's all about. Okay, so without any more waffling, let's go ahead and get started. Ethical relativism is the idea that morality is relative. But let's start with some definitions. The first key idea is the idea of objectivity in ethics. And as our textbook author uses the term, objective moral standards are moral principles that are true for all people regardless of what they believe. So the key idea with moral objectivity is that moral claims or moral principles or moral rules or moral ideas can be good or bad, true or false, better or worse. In short, objectivity in ethics is the idea that moral claims can be true regardless of what we believe. There is a potential for confusion here. Objectivity in ethics does not mean absolutism in ethics. And so absolutism in ethics would be the idea that the moral rules have no exceptions. That is, stealing and lying and killing are always wrong, regardless of the consequences, without exception. That would be moral absolutism. Moral objectivity isn't saying that. It's just saying that moral claims can be true or false. They're not merely matters of opinion. All right, and so that's the idea of objectivity in ethics. Ethical relativism is opposed to the idea of objectivity in ethics, but I think in order to understand it, you're going to have to, well, there are a variety of theories that are opposed to the idea of objectivity in ethics, and I think it will be necessary to kind of contrast ethical relativism with those other theories. And so these are theories that are against the idea of objectivity in ethics. Either they doubt the objectivity in ethics or they outright deny that moral claims are objective. There's something called moral nihilism, which is just the idea that there's really no such thing as right and wrong. There's no such thing as good and bad in the moral sense. That is, morality isn't real. It doesn't exist. Another view that denies objectivity in ethics is a view we talked about last week, moral skepticism. Now, our textbook author uses the term moral skepticism, as a synonym for the denial of objectivity in ethics. That's not a good way of putting it. Our textbook author says that moral skepticism just is a denial of objectivity in ethics. But generally speaking, more broadly, moral skepticism is an attitude of doubt about morality, and so the moral skeptic thinks that moral claims cannot be known to be true or false. That is, maybe there's such a thing as a true or false moral claim, but it's unknowable to us. So morality cannot be known. That's moral skepticism. And then there's something called ethical relativism, which is our topic this week. Whenever anybody tells you they're a relativist, you kind of have to ask yourself two questions. The first is, what is it that you think is relative? Is it the truth that's relative? Is it knowledge that's relative? Is it aesthetics or beauty that's relative? Is it morality that's relative? What is it that you think is relative? And second of all, what do you think that it's relative to? Is it relative to the individual? Is it relative to the culture or the society or the country or the time, etc.? Ethical relativism is the idea that morality is relative, or moral claims are relative. And our textbook author points out there are really two varieties of ethical relativism. The one he calls ethical subjectivism, which is the idea that morality is relative to the individual. The other is cultural relativism, which is the idea that morality is relative not to the individual, but to the culture or to society. Now, I'm putting cultural relativism in a different color here on purpose because when I talk about ethical relativism, cultural relativism is the theory that I have in mind. So what the cultural relativist thinks is that each society or each culture has its own moral codes that are correct only for members of that society. Of the views that are against objectivity and ethics, I think this one is the most plausible. In fact, I would like to leave moral nihilism, skepticism, and subjectivism behind so that we can make some progress in ethics. It seems to me that like nihilism, skepticism, and subjectivism are not only wrong, they don't even really get up to the level of being wrong. That is, they don't really qualify as moral theories, they don't really work as moral theories. If you think about what a moral theory is supposed to do, a moral theory is meant to regulate interpersonal behavior. It's meant to resolve conflicts. It's meant to promote the general welfare. It's meant to protect individual rights. And if we take nihilism, skepticism, or subjectivism seriously, we will be unable to do any of those things. That is, nihilism, skepticism, and subjectivism don't function as moral theories because they don't even do the bare minimum of what you would expect a moral theory to do. So let me give you kind of a simple example. An adequate moral theory, in my view, should explain why it would be wrong for me to steal your stuff. And so maybe you have a nice car or a nice computer, and if I take it, you probably will think something like, that was wrong, that was stealing, you're not allowed to do that, that's against the rules, you have violated my property rights, and you are to blame. And that would be a sensible thing to say. But if you think about nihilism, skepticism, and subjectivism, if true, all those claims that you make about my stealing from you would be false or impossible. And so to me, an adequate moral theory is one that could explain why I would be to blame for stealing your car, why there is a moral rule that says stealing is wrong, why you have a right to property. And, well, let's go through it. So nihilism says there's no such thing as right and wrong. I steal your car, you say, hey, that's wrong, you are to blame, you violated my rights, and I say, we're nihilists, there's no such thing as right and wrong. Or maybe you're a moral skeptic and you think that morality is unknowable. And so I steal your car, you say that I violated your rights and I am to blame, that I've done something morally wrong, and I say, you can't know that. That's unknowable. You can't know whether or not my stealing from you was wrong. Okay, so that fails as well. Well, what about subjectivism? I steal your car, you say, hey, you violated my rights, you're to blame, you've broken the moral law, stealing is wrong, etc., etc. And I say, well, I mean, maybe stealing is wrong for you, but it's not wrong for me. That is, morality is subjective, to each his own. So, in fact, for me, stealing is good. You see, subjectivism, skepticism, and nihilism can't even make sense of the most elementary and obvious moral claims, like my stealing from you is morally wrong. And so that's why I say I don't want to waste any time with him. I'd rather spend my time on moral theories that have some prospect of working. So what about cultural relativism? Well, what the cultural relativist says, remember, is that morality is a system of norms and customs. They might vary from society to society. That is, each society has its own customs and norms that are the correct moral code for that society. But at least within a given society or culture, there is some moral order, right? That is, so I steal your car, and you say that's wrong, that I violated your rights. Well, just so happens that we do actually live in a society that has property rights, that believes that there's a moral rule or a moral law that prohibits stealing, that would blame me for taking your car. That is, if I take your car, I have violated the norms and customs and traditions of my society, and I can be blamed. And so, at least cultural relativism passes this sort of rudimentary test of moral adequacy. So when I talk about ethical relativism, unless I indicate otherwise, what I really have in mind is cultural relativism. And so the rest of what I have to say is really about cultural relativism. Okay, so I want to say, in short, cultural relativism is one of a variety of theories that deny the idea of an objective morality. And objective morality is just the idea that moral claims are true regardless of what people believe. And the cultural relativist says, no. Each culture has its own moral code that is correct only for members of that culture. So let's do a little analysis of that view. All right, so this is towards cultural relativism. Start with the story from the ancient Greek historian Herodotus. In his histories, he recounts a tale of the Emperor Darius, who was Greek. And the ancient Greek emperor Darius noticed and was impressed by the fact that people from other societies and other cultures had different worldviews and different lifestyles than the Greeks. And Herodotus recounts a story of the Emperor Darius bringing in people from these different cultures. And he gives the example of the Greek custom of cremation or burning the dead. And so the Greeks would build a funeral pyre and they would burn the dead. And they thought that that was right. But Darius heard that there were other cultures, like the Galatians, who didn't burn their dead. In fact, they ate the dead. And so Darius calls in a group of Greeks and he asks them, what would it take for me to convince you to give up the Greek custom of burning the dead and take up the Galatian custom of eating the dead? Well, how do you suppose the Greeks reacted? Well, of course, they were disgusted and appalled at the suggestion, as maybe many of you are. That is, eating the dead is obviously wrong. Everybody knows the right thing to do, the proper thing to do, is to burn the dead. And then Herodotus says that Darius brings in a group of Galatians and asks them the same sort of question. What would it take for me to convince you to give up the Galatian custom of eating the dead and take up the Greek custom of burning them? How do you suppose the Galatians reacted? Well, they were likewise shocked and appalled. We would never dishonor our sacred dead by burning them, when every good Galatian knows that the right thing to do, the proper thing to do, is to eat them. And Herodotus, reflecting on this passage, says, famously, that if one were to offer men to choose out of all the customs in the world such as seemed to them best, they would examine the whole number and end by preferring their own. If one were to offer men to choose out of all the customs in the world such as seemed to them best, they would examine the whole number and end by preferring their own. And so this can be summarized with the phrase, custom is king. The Greeks preferred burning the dead because that was their custom. And they thought the Galatian custom of eating the dead was wrong, and vice versa. Herodotus here is pointing to an example of something that I'm going to call moral variance. And moral variance is just the idea that different cultures have different moral codes. And that's just a matter of fact. Herodotus is giving the example of funerary practices. So some cultures burn the dead, some cultures bury the dead, some cultures do burials at sea, some cultures apparently eat the dead. You can easily multiply examples of this kind. There's different marital practices. Some cultures are monogamous, some cultures are polygamous. Some cultures believe that divorce should be relatively easy. Some cultures believe that divorce should be very rare or not allowed at all. Some cultures allow for gay marriage, some cultures don't. Some cultures think that marriages should be arranged by parents. Other cultures think that marriage should be for love. There's different ideas about gender roles in society. There's different ideas about what people can eat. There's different ideas about how people can dress. So, you know, some cultures think that women should be, wives and homemakers. Other cultures have liberated women and allowed them to participate in public life. Some cultures eat pork and beef and other cultures don't. Some cultures require women to cover their breasts, other cultures don't. Some cultures require women to cover their hair, other cultures don't. Some cultures require women to cover their faces, other cultures don't. And so on and so forth. And so you can easily multiply a list of examples of ways in which morals vary from one culture to another. And this is one of the lessons of 20th century social science. So by social science, I mean sociology, history, anthropology. These social sciences came to adopt ethical relativism as their dominant view in the 20th century. And so I started with this passage from Alan Bloom, who says that all of his students in the 20th century are relativists. And that's not an accident, because this view was taught to them either explicitly or implicitly as part of the social studies curriculum, because this view really was the dominant view in 20th century social sciences. And by the end of this lesson, you should really understand why that is. And well, here's one of the reasons. The more anthropologists and sociologists studied people from other cultures and other societies, the more they were impressed with the way people differ. As I said, different marital customs, different funerary practices, different gender roles, different standards of diet, standards of dress, different sexual norms. For example, there was an anthropologist, sociologist, social scientist in the 20th century named Malinowski, who studied the Trobriand Islanders, which were a group of indigenous people who lived near Papua New Guinea. And he found out all kinds of interesting things about the Trobriand Islanders. Here's one funny one, that a little irrelevant but funny. The Trobriand Islanders had a funny belief about where babies came from, that they thought that they believed in reincarnation, and so they believed if you died, your spirit would leave your body, it would leave the island of the living and go to the island of the dead. It would swim to the island of the dead, and then when it was time to be reincarnated, when it was time to be born again, the spirit would swim back from the island of the dead to the island of the living, where it would enter the womb of a young lady who was swimming or bathing. And so the advice of Trobriand Islanders to young women who didn't want to get pregnant was not to go in the water past your knees. Another kind of interesting thing about the Trobriand Islanders is that they were, by Western standards, very sort of free in their sexuality. Their children played sexual games, they became sexually active at a young age, they would often take multiple partners, they were kind of, well, not so prudish as 20th century Westerners were anyway. And this is the kind of thing that social scientists in the 20th century were discovering all the time. Incidentally, it was relatively easy to convince the Trobriand Islanders to take up Western means of birth control. because that was just a matter of fact. The birth control that we introduced worked better than telling girls not to go in the water past their knees. But they were much less willing to take up Western sexual norms. They're perfectly happy being sort of, well, more free sexually than we are. Okay, so there's that. And a lot of this can be explained by the context that the Trobriand Islanders found themselves in. And so they ate a lot of yams, and yams, I guess, are like an estrogen mimicker, and so that kind of lowered their fertility rates. And they were very promiscuous, and well, all that's kind of related. You see, of course they were promiscuous because their fertility rates were low. And the same reason they had trouble figuring out where babies came from in the first place. That is, the Trobriand Islanders' worldview and belief system makes sense in their sort of geographical, cultural context. And that's the social scientist way of thinking, is that we should understand everybody's kind of worldview and moral norms and beliefs in terms of their cultural, geographical, historical context. Another kind of an example like this, it's widely discussed, is the example of infanticide. That's the killing of infants. If you're a social scientist, you probably already know this, but cultures all over the world have practiced infanticide at different times in their histories. Modern Westerners, of course, are against infanticide. It's actually one of the reasons that modern Westerners are against infanticide is because of the influence of Christianity. Christianity from the very beginning has been opposed to infanticide and the killing of infants. But if you go back to pre-Christian Europe, you'll find that infanticide was very common in Rome and in ancient Greece. And of course, maybe you know about the Spartans killing their babies. In the 20th century, a lot of the social science literature talks about Eskimo or Inuit infanticide, but you can find, or even as late as the 20th century, there's infanticide that happened in China when they had the one-child policy, and you can find examples of this all over history. And so it's not just that people differ about things like what to dress, how to dress, and what to eat. They also differ on things like whether or not it's morally acceptable to kill infants. Again, usually the social scientists will want to understand this in the cultural context. So, why did the Spartans kill babies? Well, because they were a warrior culture, and the babies that didn't look like they would grow up to be physically fit warriors weren't going to have a place in the society. Why do we see infanticide in China? Well, because they had a one-child policy, and their culture prioritized boy children over girl children. Why did we find infanticide among the Eskimos? Well, it was a matter of survival. They were nomadic hunter-gatherers in an Arctic climate, whose survival required that they keep the tribe small. That is, if they let the tribe get too big, people would starve. And so it was done as a matter of survival. And so actually, if you look at the history of infanticide, usually the reasons that infanticide is practiced in other cultures are a lot like the reasons that people give in defense of abortion today. It's done for economic reasons because we can't afford to feed the kids, or it's done for like genetic reasons. So, you know, if a baby is born with some severe handicap or disability that's going to cause it to suffer and die anyway, then better that, oh, what? I hate to say it. Anyway, okay, so different cultures have different moral codes. And the more you study social science, the more you'll be impressed by this, because you'll learn about things like infanticide. And so that's the first thing. The second kind of lesson of 20th century social science is they develop an ethic of tolerance. And the idea is that it would be wrong to interfere in another culture. It would be wrong to judge another culture by the standards of your own culture. That the right attitude to have toward people of another culture is one of tolerance and open-mindedness. And really, more so, not only should we be tolerant and open-minded towards other cultures, but we should celebrate our differences. We should celebrate the sort of the diverse cultures of the world and all their differences. And so we call it an ethic of tolerance and open-mindedness, let's say. Non-judgment, non-interference, etc. And, well, why did they develop this ethic of tolerance and open-mindedness? As far as I can tell, there's sort of two main reasons. One is sort of a practical reason, and the other is a moral reason. So the practical reason is you better be open-minded if you're going to be a social scientist. That is, if you want to learn about other cultures, then you need to be open-minded. Closed-minded anthropologists and sociologists don't make very good anthropologists and sociologists. And so I mentioned Malinowski. You can imagine if when he arrived at the Trobriand Islands, the first thing he had noticed was that the women were topless, and he scolded them and told them to put some clothes on their women, that was disgusting that they were going around bare-breasted. And the second thing he did was when he found out about their sort of permissive sexual immorality, he told them that they were gross and disgusting and depraved, and that maybe if he was invited to join in one of their meals, and when they served him some of their traditional cuisine, he said, "You're gonna eat that? That's the grossest thing I've ever seen. Get that out of my face." You see, so you can imagine how much would he have learned about the Trobriand Islanders if he had that kind of closed-minded attitude? Well, not very much. And so if you want to learn about other cultures, you need to immerse yourself in their cultures. And you need to live as they live. And you want to sort of observe their ceremonies and enjoy their cuisine and listen to their music. And when they do something that's unusual to you, you want to be curious and open-minded and seeking to learn and seeking to understand. And so that's the first thing is closed-minded bigots make very bad anthropologists. If you want to be an anthropologist or sociologist, you need to keep an open mind regarding cultural differences. So that's one reason for the ethic of tolerance and open-mindedness. The other is kind of a moral reason. Is I think the cultural relativists and the social scientists who support cultural relativism sort of use relativism as an antidote to dogmatism and bigotry. And so in the 20th century, social scientists are looking back on Western history with a certain amount of remorse and regret. And so kind of a little vocabulary exercise here. I mean, consider things like xenophobia, which is fear of foreigners, or colonialism, which is trying to establish colonies to spread our culture throughout the world, or Eurocentrism, which is European-centered thinking, which is the idea that Europe is the center of the world, that European culture is superior and other cultures are inferior. Or ethnocentrism, which is the idea, which is really kind of a racism. It's the idea that my ethnicity is superior to others. And I think 20th century anthropologists and sociologists and social scientists are looking back on a history of xenophobia and colonialism and Eurocentrism and ethnocentrism with a certain amount of remorse and regret. And so, for example, consider the horrors that were visited on the Native Americans by the European colonists. Consider in school you probably learned about the Trail of Tears. You probably learned about Manifest Destiny. You probably learned about slavery and the Middle Passage and all these things. And if you think about, well, what motivated early Americans to commit the atrocities that were committed against African slaves and Native Americans? What was this attitude that European culture was superior and that African and Native American culture were inferior? That is, what was Manifest Destiny? Well, it was the idea that it was God's will that we, Christians, should spread our superior Christian civilization from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was our destiny. And so much for the sort of savage people who were in the way. They would either have to assimilate or die. And indeed, tragically, many of them did die. And who knows how many languages and cultures have been lost to history because our ancestors regarded them as savage and uncivilized. This was the attitude that justified slavery too, wasn't it? It was this idea that, well, Africans were primitive, and that somehow the Europeans were superior and more civilized. And so I think this is a big part of what's happening in 20th century social sciences. They're looking at things like the resident schools for Native Americans, the Battle of Wounded Knee, Trail of Tears, the whole history of colonialism and oppression. And I think if I'm being as charitable as possible toward the ethical relativist, it's sort of this perspective that you get from the social sciences, that first of all, as a matter of fact, different cultures do have different moral codes, and those moral codes are a reflect of their historical, social, geographical circumstances. And also that we should be open-minded and tolerant. We shouldn't imagine that our culture is superior and other cultures are inferior. First of all, we won't learn anything about other cultures that way. And second of all, what's worse is that attitude is the attitude of people who commit atrocities. Okay, good. So at this point, you should understand what ethical relativism is, and you should understand why ethical relativism came to be sort of the dominant view in 20th century social science. I think I'm going to pause the video here, and in the next video, we'll get into some sort of critical analysis of the theory, sort of a quick preview. Although this was the dominant theory in 20th century social science, people in my discipline, the majority of us now recognize that this theory has serious practical and theoretical problems, and we'll get into those in the next video. Thank you.